My name is Philip, and I want to take you on a journey with me, my journey of learning English. To give you a little background, I grew up in a place where English wasn't commonly spoken. In my daily life, I used my native language to communicate, whether at home, school, or with friends. English always felt like something far away, something I didn't really need in my day-to-day activities. But as I grew older, I realized the importance of English in the world around me. I started seeing how knowing English opened doors to new opportunities, especially in education, work, and connecting with people from different countries. One day, I saw an advertisement for a job that seemed like a perfect fit for me. But there was one big problem. I needed to know English. At that moment, I felt stuck. I didn't know how to read English well, and speaking it was even harder for me. That job opportunity was out of my reach simply because of my lack of English skills. That was a turning point for me. I decided I wanted to learn English, not just for work, but to explore new possibilities in my life. I wanted to travel, meet people from different cultures, watch movies without subtitles, and read books that were only available in English. I also saw how English was a bridge that connected people from all over the world. It wasn't just about speaking another language. It was about being part of a global conversation. But when I first started, I was a complete beginner. I didn't know where to start or how to start. The English alphabet was familiar, but words seemed confusing, and sentences were even harder to understand. I remember trying to read a simple English sentence and feeling completely lost. Even basic words like hello or thank you felt strange to me. I didn't know how to form sentences, how to ask questions, or even how to greet someone properly in English. Everything felt overwhelming, and it was clear that I was starting from zero. Despite these feelings of uncertainty, I was determined to learn. I knew it wouldn't be easy, but I was ready to put in the effort. I was starting from the very beginning, but I believed that if I took small steps, I could slowly improve. And that's exactly how my journey began. When I first decided to learn English, I wasn't sure where to begin. I didn't have anyone around me who spoke the language fluently, and I didn't know much about how to study a foreign language. But I knew one thing. I had to take the first step, no matter how small. My journey with English began in a simple way. I remember sitting in front of my computer, searching online for ways to start learning. I came across an app for beginners that promised to teach basic words and phrases. It seemed easy enough, so I downloaded it. I still remember the first word I learned, hello. It was such a simple word, but for me, it felt like opening a door to a whole new world. I practiced saying it out loud, repeating it over and over until it felt natural. I learned to say thank you, sorry, and please. Small words, but important ones for building a foundation. Even though I was excited to start, the challenges came quickly. One of the first things I noticed was that English words often didn't sound the way they were spelled. The pronunciation was tricky. I would look at a word, try to say it, and then realize I was completely wrong. For example, the word through looked simple, but when I tried to say it, I couldn't believe how different it sounded from what I expected. It felt frustrating, like the language was full of puzzles. Another big challenge for me was vocabulary. When I started, I had such a small collection of words in my mind. I could say a few basic things like hello or yes, but beyond that, I struggled to express myself. I would see or hear a word and then forget it a few minutes later. It seemed like every time I learned something new, I would forget it just as quickly. This made it hard to practice or have conversations because I didn't know enough words to say what I wanted. I also had no idea how to put words together into a proper sentence. English sentence structure was very different from my native language, and it took me a long time to understand how the words should be arranged. Then there was the issue of grammar. Grammar rules were confusing, especially things like verb tenses. In my language, the past, present, and future were pretty straightforward, but in English, it felt like there were so many different rules. I would mix up simple sentences like I go and I went, and every time I tried to use the correct tense, I second-guessed myself. Even though I understood the rules on paper, when it came time to speak or write, I often froze, unsure of which form to use. This made me nervous, and I would sometimes avoid speaking altogether, afraid of making mistakes. Speaking was, without a doubt, the hardest part. It's one thing to practice words by yourself, but when you try to speak in real time, it feels completely different. I remember the first time I tried to speak English with someone. It was a short conversation, but I was so nervous. I could feel my heart racing, and even though I had practiced, I forgot the words as soon as the person started talking to me. I stumbled through the conversation, making mistake after mistake. I mispronounced words, used the wrong grammar, and my sentences didn't make sense. I felt embarrassed, but at the same time, I knew that making mistakes was part of the process. To help myself improve, I started using every resource I could find. First, I bought a few beginner English books. These were very simple, with short sentences and pictures to help me understand the meaning. I would spend hours reading these books, trying to remember the new words and repeating them out loud. The pictures helped a lot because they gave me a visual connection to the words, making it easier to remember. Next, I started watching English videos online. At first, I couldn't understand much, but I found videos with subtitles, which helped a lot. I would listen and read the subtitles at the same time, trying to match the sounds with the words on the screen. I found that watching simple children's cartoons in English was one of the best ways for me to practice listening and pronunciation. The characters spoke slowly and clearly, which made it easier for me to follow along. I also signed up for an online English class. This was a big step for me because it meant I had to practice speaking with other learners and the teacher. The class was made for beginners like me, so everyone was at the same level. The teacher was very patient and encouraged us to speak, even if we made mistakes. During the class, we practiced basic conversations like asking for directions, ordering food, or introducing ourselves. It was scary at first, but over time, I started to feel more comfortable speaking in front of others. The support from the teacher and my classmates helped me build my confidence. Additionally, I discovered a few language learning apps that made studying fun. These apps gave me daily challenges, like learning 5 new words each day or practicing short phrases. The best part was that I could do these activities anywhere, while commuting, waiting in line, or just relaxing at home. The more I practiced, the better I got at remembering new words and phrases. Slowly but surely, these resources helped me build a foundation in English. It wasn't easy, and there were many days when I felt like I wasn't making any progress. But looking back now, I realized that every small step I took was bringing me closer to my goal. Each new word, each sentence I formed, and each conversation I tried was helping me improve, even if it didn't feel like it at the time. As I moved forward in my English learning journey, I realized that progress didn't happen overnight. I had to be patient and develop strategies that worked for me. I started by breaking everything down into small, manageable steps. I knew I couldn't learn the entire language at once, so I focused on learning little by little, day by day. The first thing I did was practice basic words and phrases. I made it a point to learn a few new words every day. At first, these were very simple words like apple, book, car, or water. I would write each word down in a small notebook and practice it whenever I had time. I also learned useful phrases like how to ask questions or introduce myself. How are you? What's your name? Nice to meet you. I repeated these phrases to myself all the time, even when I was alone. I would say them while walking or even while cooking. Any chance I got, I practiced. It helped me get comfortable with these basic elements of the language. One strategy that worked for me was focusing on repetition. I would repeat new words or phrases over and over until they stuck in my memory. This might sound boring, but it really worked. I found that the more I repeated something, the easier it became to recall it later. I also tried to use these words and phrases in different contexts. For example, if I learned the word apple, I would try to form different sentences with it. This is an apple. I like apples. Or apples are red. This helped me understand how to use words in real situations. Another important strategy for me was listening to English as much as possible. In the beginning, I didn't understand much, but I knew that listening was key to improving my comprehension and pronunciation. So, I started watching English movies and TV shows. At first, I watched with subtitles. I picked movies that I had already seen in my own language because it made it easier to follow the story. I also chose shows with simple language, like children's cartoons or educational programs. These shows used clear, slow speech, which helped me understand the pronunciation of words and the flow of English sentences. Over time, I moved on to more challenging material, but I always made sure to pause and replay scenes whenever I didn't understand something. I would listen to how the characters said certain words and try to imitate them. This helped me improve my accent and understand the natural rhythm of the language. It was a slow process, but every time I watched a movie, I could pick up a few more words and phrases. Eventually, I found that I didn't need to rely on subtitles as much, and I could start enjoying English content without always needing to read along. In addition to watching movies, I also listened to English music. Music became a fun way for me to learn new vocabulary and get used to hearing the language. I would listen to popular English songs, and even though I didn't understand all the words at first, I loved how the language sounded. I began looking up the lyrics of my favorite songs and translating them into my own language. This helped me learn new expressions, and I found that music made it easier for me to remember phrases because they were set to a tune. I would often find myself humming a song and realizing I had learned a new word or phrase without even trying. Music made learning feel less like a chore and more like an enjoyable part of my daily routine. Another key strategy for me was speaking with others. At first, This was the hardest part. I was shy and afraid of making mistakes, but I knew that if I wanted to improve my speaking skills, I had to practice with real people. I found a local language exchange group where people from different countries would meet up to practice speaking English. This was a game changer for me. The group was made up of other learners like me, so there was no pressure to be perfect. We would practice simple conversations like asking for directions or talking about our hobbies. The more I spoke, the more confident I became. One thing I quickly learned was that mistakes were part of the process. I made a lot of them, especially in the beginning. Sometimes I would say the wrong word, mix up my tenses, or forget a phrase completely. But the people I practiced with were kind and patient. They understood that learning a language isn't easy, and they encouraged me to keep trying, even when I got it wrong. Over time, I realized that every mistake I made helped me get better. Instead of being embarrassed, I started to see mistakes as opportunities to learn. In addition to the language exchange group, I also tried to speak English whenever I could in my daily life. If I met someone who spoke English, I would try to start a simple conversation, even if it was just saying hello or asking how they were doing. These small interactions helped me build my confidence. The more I spoke, the easier it became to think in English instead of translating everything in my head. Another simple but effective strategy was labeling things around my house in English. I would put sticky notes on everyday objects like the refrigerator, the door, or the TV. Each note had the English word for that item written on it. So every time I used the object, I would see the English word and practice saying it out loud. This helped me expand my vocabulary in a very practical way because I was learning words that I used regularly. To make learning more enjoyable, I also played language learning games. These games challenged me to match words with pictures, fill in missing words in sentences, or form correct sentences from scrambled words. They were fun, and they made learning feel less stressful. I could play these games on my phone or computer, which meant I could practice English anywhere, even if I only had a few minutes to spare. One thing that helped me stay motivated was setting small, achievable goals. Instead of trying to master English all at once, I focused on specific tasks each week. One week, my goal might be to learn 10 new vocabulary words. Another week, I would focus on practicing a particular grammar rule. These small goals helped me track my progress and gave me a sense of accomplishment. Every time I reached a goal, no matter how small, I felt more motivated to keep going. Learning English was definitely not an easy journey for me. Like any beginner, I faced many challenges, and at times, it felt overwhelming. One of the biggest difficulties I encountered early on was a lack of confidence. I remember feeling very unsure of myself whenever I tried to speak English. It was almost like my mind would go blank whenever I needed to form a sentence. Even though I had practiced words and phrases, I felt nervous about saying them out loud in front of other people. I was always worried about making mistakes and what others would think if I didn't speak perfectly. This fear held me back from speaking for a long time. In the beginning, I also struggled with understanding grammar. English grammar seemed confusing and complicated. I couldn't figure out when to use the past tense or how to form proper sentences. Words like was and were or is and are seemed to blend together, and I would constantly get them mixed up. It was frustrating because I wanted to speak well, but it felt like there were so many rules to remember. And then, of course, there were the exceptions to those rules. Every time I thought I had mastered one aspect of grammar, I would come across a situation where the rule didn't apply, and it felt like I was back to square one. Another big challenge was expanding my vocabulary. As a beginner, it felt like there were so many words to learn that I didn't know where to start. I often found myself wanting to express something in English, but lacking the words to do so. I would have the idea in my mind, but I didn't know the English words to say it. This made conversations difficult, and I sometimes felt embarrassed or discouraged. It was hard to keep a conversation going when I kept pausing to think of the right words. Listening comprehension was another area where I faced difficulties. Even though I was practicing listening to English through movies and songs, there were many times when native speakers spoke too quickly for me to understand. I remember trying to listen to English news or a podcast, and it just felt like a blur of sounds. I couldn't pick out individual words, and I often had to pause and replay parts just to catch a sentence. It was frustrating because I knew that understanding spoken English was key to real-life communication, but I felt like I was far behind. Speaking with native speakers or more fluent English speakers was also very challenging. I felt shy and awkward, especially in the early stages of learning. Whenever I tried to have a conversation, I would find myself stumbling over my words or forgetting what I had planned to say. It was hard to keep my sentences flowing smoothly, and this often led to long pauses or broken sentences. I could tell that some people had trouble understanding me, which only made me more self-conscious. I remember thinking to myself, what if they laugh at my mistakes? Or, what if I say something wrong and they don't understand me at all? Despite these challenges, I knew I couldn't give up. I realized that overcoming these obstacles would take time and persistence. One of the first things I did to build my confidence was to change my mindset about mistakes. Instead of seeing mistakes as something to be ashamed of, I started viewing them as part of the learning process. I told myself, it's okay to make mistakes. Everyone does it, and it's how you learn. This shift in attitude made a huge difference. I no longer felt so afraid of speaking or practicing with others, and I understood that every mistake was actually helping me improve. To deal with my grammar struggles, I started using different resources like grammar books and apps that broke down the rules in a simpler way. I found online videos that explained tricky grammar points in a very basic and clear manner. I would watch these videos multiple times until I fully understood the concept. I also practiced exercises that focused on grammar, repeating them until I felt more comfortable with the rules. It took time, but with practice, I began to notice improvements. I learned to be patient with myself and accept that mastering grammar wouldn't happen overnight. Vocabulary building was another area where I had to work hard. To overcome this challenge, I made it a habit to learn a few new words each day, focusing on words that were useful in daily life. I also started using flashcards to memorize new vocabulary. Every time I learned a new word, I would write it on a card, along with a sentence using the word. I carried these flashcards with me and reviewed them whenever I had a spare moment. This method really helped me retain new words, and slowly, my vocabulary expanded. Listening comprehension improved when I found materials suited to my level. Instead of jumping straight into native-level content, I switched to English listening exercises that were designed for beginners. These materials used slower, clearer speech, which helped me understand better. Over time, I challenged myself with more advanced content, but I always made sure to go at my own pace. I also started listening to English podcasts specifically made for language learners. The hosts spoke more slowly, and they explained difficult words, which made it much easier to follow along. Speaking became less intimidating as I began to practice more regularly with supportive people. I was lucky to have friends who were patient and encouraging. They didn't mind my mistakes, and they often corrected me in a helpful way. They would gently point out where I had gone wrong, and they would explain how to say things correctly. This feedback was invaluable because it allowed me to learn in a real-life setting where I could immediately apply the corrections. In addition to friends, I also found support from online communities. I joined several forums and groups where people were learning English just like me. These communities were a great source of encouragement. We would share tips, study materials, and even practice speaking with one another through voice or video calls. Everyone understood the challenges of learning a new language, so there was no judgment. Whenever I felt stuck or discouraged, I could turn to these groups for advice or motivation, and that kept me going. One major source of support came from teachers as well. I enrolled in an English class, and my teacher was incredibly understanding and helpful. She knew how difficult it was for beginners, so she made the lessons engaging and interactive. We practiced speaking, writing, and listening in every class, and she would always encourage us to ask questions. If I didn't understand something, she took the time to explain it in a way that made sense to me. Having a teacher who believed in my ability to learn was a huge confidence boost. Over time, I realized that persistence was the key to overcoming all these challenges. Whenever I felt like giving up, I reminded myself how far I had already come. I had started as a complete beginner, but I was gradually making progress. Each small improvement, whether it was mastering a new word, having a smoother conversation, or understanding a podcast, was a victory that kept me motivated. Looking back now, I'm proud of the challenges I faced because they made me stronger and more determined to succeed. One of the most memorable moments in my journey of learning English came when I realized that things were finally starting to click. I had been studying for a while, practicing every day, and although the process felt slow, there was one specific event that made me feel like I was really improving. It was during a casual conversation with a friend who was a native English speaker. We were talking about something simple: weekend plans, the weather, and maybe a little bit about work. Normally, these conversations would make me anxious. I would overthink every word, worrying about whether I was using the right tenses or the correct vocabulary. But this time, something was different. As we were talking, I noticed that I wasn't struggling as much as I usually did. I wasn't constantly searching for words or hesitating before I spoke. Instead, I was able to participate in the conversation more naturally. At that moment, I realized that I had just held a conversation in English without needing to translate in my head. It wasn't perfect, of course. There were still a few mistakes. But I understood everything my friend said, and I was able to respond without getting stuck. This might seem like a small achievement to someone fluent, but to me, it was huge. It felt like all the practice, all the mistakes, and all the challenges were starting to pay off. For the first time, I truly felt confident that I could speak English. This turning point gave me a rush of motivation. I remember going home that day with a renewed sense of purpose. I thought to myself, if I can handle a conversation like this, then I can definitely improve even more. This small achievement of having a comfortable conversation was like a spark that reignited my passion for learning. I was eager to continue practicing, and for the first time in a while, I didn't feel like I was stuck. I felt like I was moving forward. Another small but powerful achievement came when I started to understand English movies without subtitles. In the past, I always needed subtitles to follow along, especially if the characters spoke quickly or used slang. But one night, I was watching a movie that I had already seen a few times before, and I realized that I could understand most of it without reading the subtitles. I could follow the plot, understand the characters' emotions, and even pick up on jokes or expressions that had gone over my head before. This realization filled me with excitement. It was like a whole new world had opened up to me. Watching movies had always been one of my favorite hobbies, and now I could enjoy them in English, just like I had always wanted to. It wasn't just about learning new vocabulary or grammar rules anymore. It was about being able to experience and enjoy English in a way that felt natural. It was a fun and rewarding way to learn, and it made me want to watch more movies and shows to continue improving. Another big moment came when I wrote my first proper message in English without using any translation tools. I had been texting a friend, and instead of using Google Translate like I usually did, I decided to try writing the message entirely on my own. It was a short message, something like, "Hey, I hope you're doing well. I'm thinking of going to the park later. Want to join?" But I felt a huge sense of pride after sending it. I didn't need to double-check every word, and I didn't feel anxious about making a mistake. It was a small step, but it showed me that I had come a long way from the days when even writing simple sentences felt impossible. I began to notice more small achievements as well. For example, I started to understand English songs better. In the past, I could only catch a few words here and there, but now I was able to follow the lyrics and even sing along. Music became another way for me to practice, and I loved how it made learning feel less like studying and more like something enjoyable. These small moments of understanding, a word, a sentence, a lyric, felt like little victories, and each one motivated me to keep going. Another turning point happened when I realized that I wasn't afraid to speak up in group settings anymore. Before, when I was with a group of English speakers, I would stay quiet, afraid of making a mistake or not being able to keep up with the conversation. But one day, I found myself actively participating in a group discussion without overthinking it. I shared my thoughts, asked questions, and contributed to the conversation just like everyone else. Sure, there were still a few mistakes, but I wasn't letting them hold me back anymore. I wasn't frozen with fear like I used to be. What was even more motivating was the feedback I received from others. My friends began to notice that my English was improving, and they often complimented me on my progress. Hearing things like, "Your English has gotten so much better," or "You're speaking more fluently now," was incredibly encouraging. It reminded me that all the hard work I had put in wasn't going unnoticed, and it gave me the confidence to keep pushing myself. These small victories added up over time and made a huge difference in my confidence. They were proof that my efforts were paying off, and they showed me that learning a language isn't about making giant leaps overnight. It's about the steady progress you make each day. Each conversation, each word I learned, each sentence I wrote was a step forward. I realized that learning English didn't have to be a perfect linear process. There would be ups and downs, days when I felt like I was improving and days when I felt stuck. But those small daily achievements were what kept me motivated and reminded me that I was on the right path. Looking back now, I see that the turning point wasn't just about one moment. It was about recognizing and celebrating the small milestones along the way. Whether it was understanding a conversation, writing a message, or enjoying a movie in English, each of these moments reminded me why I started this journey in the first place. They gave me the motivation to keep learning and the confidence to believe that I could reach my goals. After I experienced those small but motivating turning points in my English learning journey, I knew that I couldn't stop there. It was exciting to see how much I had grown, but I also realized that learning a language is an ongoing process. English wasn't something I could learn and then forget about. I needed to keep practicing, improving, and challenging myself. I had built a solid foundation with basic words, grammar, and conversations, but now it was time to move on to more advanced skills. One of the first things I did to continue my learning was to push myself outside of my comfort zone. While I had gotten more comfortable with everyday conversations, I realized that I needed to focus on more complex aspects of the language, like reading advanced materials, improving my listening skills, and expanding my vocabulary. So, I began reading books in English, starting with simple novels and then gradually moving to more challenging ones. At first, it was difficult. There were so many new words and expressions that I didn't understand. I had to keep a dictionary with me to look up unfamiliar words, but I didn't let that discourage me. Instead, I saw it as an opportunity to grow. Every time I encountered a word I didn't know, I would write it down, learn its meaning, and then try to use it in a sentence later. Slowly but surely, my vocabulary started to expand. I wasn't just learning words, I was also learning how to use them in the right context, which made a huge difference in how I communicated. Reading also helped me improve my understanding of different writing styles and sentence structures. Whether I was reading an article, a book, or even a blog post, I paid attention to how sentences were formed and how ideas were expressed. This helped me a lot with my writing. I began practicing writing in English more frequently, whether it was by keeping a journal, writing short essays, or even sending longer messages to friends. The more I wrote, the more comfortable I became with expressing my thoughts in English. Another method I used to continue improving my English was to immerse myself in the language as much as possible. I made a habit of listening to podcasts and watching YouTube videos in English. This wasn't just about entertainment anymore. It became a learning tool for me. Listening to people speak naturally helped me develop a better sense of the language's rhythm, pronunciation, and common expressions. I followed English-speaking content creators who discussed a variety of topics, from travel and lifestyle to news and education. This not only helped me improve my listening skills, but also introduced me to new vocabulary and ideas. One of the most important steps I took in my journey was actively seeking out opportunities to speak with native English speakers. While reading and listening are crucial, nothing compares to real conversations. I began engaging in more conversations with native speakers, whether through language exchange apps, online communities, or even in person. Speaking regularly with people whose first language was English helped me refine my fluency. It also helped me gain confidence in how I expressed myself. I learned that it wasn't just about having perfect grammar, it was about being able to communicate my ideas clearly and effectively. At this stage of my journey, I also started focusing on my pronunciation. I realized that while people could understand me, my accent and pronunciation sometimes made it difficult for me to be clear. To work on this, I began imitating native speakers by repeating what I heard in podcasts or movies. I'd listen closely to how they pronounced certain words and practiced until I could say them more naturally. It wasn't an easy process, but over time, I noticed a big improvement in how clearly I could speak. Now, as I continue to grow my English skills, I make sure to keep a balance between practicing the basics and challenging myself with more advanced content. I've also made English a part of my daily routine. Whether I'm reading the news in English, watching a show, or speaking with a friend, I'm constantly practicing. The key is consistency. I've learned that by dedicating even a small amount of time every day to English, I can continue to improve. Looking back at my journey from a complete beginner to someone who can comfortably use English in everyday life, I've learned so much, not just about the language, but also about myself. Learning English was never easy, but it was one of the most rewarding experiences I've ever had. The challenges, the small victories, and even the mistakes all played a role in helping me grow. For anyone who's just starting out or who feels discouraged, I want to tell you this: don't give up. Learning a new language takes time, patience, and persistence, but every bit of progress you make, no matter how small, is worth it. It's easy to get frustrated when you don't understand something or when you feel like you're not improving fast enough. I've been there, but remember that learning a language isn't about being perfect. It's about making progress one step at a time. One of the most important pieces of advice I can give is to stay consistent. Even on days when it feels difficult or when you don't feel like studying, try to practice a little bit. It doesn't matter if it's 10 minutes or an hour. What matters is that you keep going. Language learning is like building a muscle. The more you work at it, the stronger it gets. Another thing to remember is that mistakes are a natural part of the process. Don't be afraid to make them. In fact, the more mistakes you make, the more opportunities you have to learn. When I first started speaking English, I made so many mistakes, mispronounced words, used the wrong tense, and sometimes even misunderstood entire conversations. But every time I made a mistake, I learned from it and got better. So, embrace your mistakes and use them as stepping stones on your journey. It's also important to enjoy the process. Find fun and engaging ways to learn English, whether it's through watching your favorite TV shows, listening to music, or having conversations with friends. The more you enjoy it, the easier it will be to stay motivated. Remember that learning doesn't always have to feel like hard work. It can be exciting and enjoyable, especially when you see yourself improving. Lastly, surround yourself with a supportive community, whether it's friends, family, teachers, or online communities. Having people who encourage and support you can make all the difference. For me, having friends who were willing to practice with me, and even teachers who believed in my progress, kept me going when I felt stuck. You don't have to do this alone. There are so many resources and people out there who can help you along the way. In conclusion, learning English has been one of the most challenging yet rewarding experiences of my life. It's taught me the value of patience, the power of persistence, and the importance of believing in myself. If you're on this journey, remember that every step you take brings you closer to your goal. Stay patient, keep practicing, and most importantly, don't give up. You'll get there, one word at a time.